Hello everyone, welcome back to another list video, and in this one I'm going to talk about my 25 most disappointing releases of 2018. 2018 had some really disappointing albums, the ones that I was really hyped for, the ones I was really expecting. Now the albums slash EPs I'm going to mention over here are the ones that I felt were kind of disappointing in the way that were just like mediocre in a sense, or just like okay. So bad albums are not going to be included on this list, and I'm not going to mention honorable mentions as well. I'm going to make another video about this topic, and I'm going to leave a link down in the description of the playlist with all my lists from 2018. So the albums that I'm going to contain in this list go from 6 plus to 5 minus. But first of all, before we get into the list, here are 7 honorable mentions. First is Stockley by Ski Mask the Slump God. I made a review of this album, and the reason it's not in this list is because I haven't been really overwhelmed by any significant release from Ski Mask up until this point. But I thought that this one, just because it's his debut studio full-length album, I was just hoping that we'll get something more, that we will finally listen to the true potential of Ski Mask the Slump God. But instead, that was not the case. We got an album with better production compared to his previous mixtapes, but other than that, he took a weird approach and direction to most of his tracks, and the results were still underwhelming, but for different reasons this time. The next one is Some Rap Songs by Earl Sweatshirt. And the reason this is not in my list is because I didn't think it was that much of a disappointment of an album. The whole concept of it works fine for the most part. However, most of the tracks just felt like fillers to me, and I ended up wanting more out of it. Next one is Joy as an Act of Resistance by Idols. Like with Some Rap Songs, the reason why this is not higher in my list is because I didn't think it was that much of a disappointment of an album. However, I think that Brutalism is way better of an album rather than this one. And yeah, in this sense, I was expecting more out of it, and I didn't really get it with this. However, I still think there are some decent songs out of this one. Music to Make War To by King Tut. The reason this is not higher in my list is because I've been kind of disappointed with a lot of the later releases from King Tut, so I didn't have that many expectations of this album to begin with, and this one just goes even more of the direction to hard rock and distorted guitars, and I think that this sound doesn't really fit King Tut. I much prefer him to his neo folk direction, and so this album was a disappointment once again. Think Peace by Clarence Clarity, that was way inferior compared to his previous album, which I thought it was decent. I thought that it was an okay album, but this one was really boring, and it was kind of a forgettable synth pop release with some experimental elements that don't really make that much of a sense. Then it's Traverse by Chaotic. I thought his previous album was a decent micro house release. I thought it was a beautiful, chill and calm release. However, I think this one, everything that made his previous work so special and so appealing in my opinion just fades away over this one. It's really forgettable, it's just a boring album. And then is Grid of Points by Grouper. Probably one of my most forgettable albums on this year. Her direction in this whole lo-fi piano sound was an okay idea, but it got really repetitive really fast. And despite it being a really short album, I just found it really boring. So, without further ado, let's get into the list. I'm not that much of a huge Sleep fan, although I can really appreciate and understand their importance in stoner rock and doom metal scene. And so I wasn't that hyped for this album to come out, hence why it's not even higher on the list. But still, I gave it a shot, and I just found it kind of boring. Although I can appreciate it as a comeback, it has many of the elements that make Sleep stand out in the first place. However, I couldn't remember anything from this album. It just flew by as a forgettable release of this year. This is Peste Noire split with Peste Noire. Doesn't this sound like the most pretentious thing ever? Now, I think the concept behind this is that we have some of the old school sounds from Peste Noire, something that sounds out of 2001. I'm not sure if these are actually recordings of 2001, but then we have the other side that contains the Peste Noire of 2018. And the first side is actually pretty cool. I really like the harsh instrumentation and raw production on this one. But the second side is weird because it contains trap parts. And what's funny is that even in the album you can see that they mention them as trap parts. They didn't even have the audacity to just say that, produced by this guy. No, they just put it as trap parts. That's actually kind of funny. Never would have thought that I would hear Famine in trap beats. And the thing is that we're talking about the most generic and most simplistic trap sounds imaginable, combined with some really raw black metal sounds. It's hard to believe, but yeah, this exists. And I won't say it's the worst thing ever, it certainly isn't, but it was confusing to say the least. The new album from Marduk, it's okay, it's decent, it's not that bad of an album, but still, it's kind of disappointing considering how many great albums they have in their discography. Yeah, this is one of those moments that didn't really stand out. Zero Cult is one of those artists that I discovered out of nowhere 2 years back, and I loved the album Closer Than Ever. It was one of my favorite releases of the year. It was such a great mix of chill, ambient techno sounds, combined with so many tribal and ethereal vibes. It was such a beautiful album. Now, Deep in Your Mind kind of has some of the elements that made his previous album so good, but not to the extent that I thought it was that impressive. However, I still think there are some decent moments. It's an okay down-tempo and chill ambient electro album, but what I recommend is to start with Closer Than Ever because I think it's a far superior album. At this point, I don't even think we will see another interesting Jean-Michel Jarre release. First we had Electronica Part 1 and Part 2, then we had Oxygen 3, and now Equinox Infinity. Just another completely unnecessary sequel to one of his most legendary albums. I can say he manages to put some sounds that go back to his roots, to his appealing ambient sound, but most of the time there is this modern touch that Jean-Michel Jarre, in my opinion, hasn't managed to connect that greatly, and as a result there are so many tracks that sound even bad, but still some decent ambient moments. Most of the time though it's just a mediocre, uninteresting release. The System Reboot is another mediocre Dope DOD album, in my opinion. I think that they haven't really managed to deliver a great album from start to finish after Master Exploder. Still, there are some okay moments, but still, if you're into really heavy and aggressive hip hop, I really recommend you check out their first albums and maybe this one. Maybe you will probably like this one more than I did. We've been waiting for 6 years for this. After Negative Fascination, an extremely interesting industrial techno release, the comeback album is a big change of direction, but not in a good way, in my opinion. Most of the sounds, the darkness, and the aggression that made his first album so great and so special are completely gone in this one, because it's mostly generic 80s retro sounds. Even though there are some okay moments here and there, most of the time the album just falls really short. In my opinion, just go and check the first album, because it's an essential industrial techno release. Konoyo is a boring ambient drone release. After Virgins, I can hardly say that anything he has released up until this point has been that interesting. I saw a lot of people praising these albums, but for me, it was not that much of my cup of tea. Maybe you will like it more, but for me, it was just decent. Again, I don't know why I cannot connect with the newer Machine Gear releases. I really liked WFLGRL, but even though I liked the change of pace and direction with the digital hardcore sound of Because I'm Young, Arrogant and I Hate Everything You Stand For, and it's kind of the same aggressive style he follows with the Ugly Art, also consisting of a drummer in this one, can't get into these albums. I can see the appeal, but the production, the ideas just fall short in my opinion. I just can't happen to enjoy this album as much as I want. It's a good digital hardcore and experimental hip hop release or some sort, but I still can't see myself like really getting into this one. Watain came with an album early this year, and I was kind of disappointed with it. It was a release that I was hoping that I would like, but you know, it's an okay, it's a decent black metal release. However, in my opinion, it's kind of boring. It's a bit mediocre, and it's one of my least favorite releases from Watain so far. Probably hardcore fans of Watain love the shit out of it. I think it's okay for the most part, but nothing that really made me come back to it. Now, there are not that many releases that I love from Lebanon Hanover. Most of the time their discography kind of been hit or miss for me. So far I found nothing that is going to surpass Tomb for Two. It's by far one of my favorite post-punk and darkwave releases of this decade. But this one in particular, I find it really forgettable. There was nothing that made me wanna come back to the album and listen to it again. If you're looking for darkwave and post-punk stuff from 2018, I still recommend this to you. I think it's one of the better albums that you're going to find out of this genre that came out this year. But you haven't heard of Lebanon Hanover already, my recommendation is not to start with this one. That's all I'm going to say. Author and Punisher is easily one of the most boundary-pushing artists of industrial metal sound this decade, but my biggest issue with especially the later albums of Author and Punisher is how one-dimensional they are. He has his custom machinery, his custom sounds, but it's like we listen to them, over and over and over again. And this is what happens with Beastland. It's literally the same thing I've heard for about 3 or 4 albums. Nothing that special. Even the production on this one doesn't sound that great. Even though I'm a fan of industrial metal and the sound and the ideas of Author and Punisher, it's getting to the point where I listen to the same thing. And I'm hoping that at least something is going to change in the future. A Girl Cried Red is an EP, but you know, whatever, let's just stick with it. A lot of people sat on this EP. I mean, in a sense, I can see why. For a lot of people, that was a major disappointment. It sounds like a 2007 emo rap album with some excruciating autotune, but I'm one of those people that I would say it's kind of okay. I didn't think it was that bad of an EP, but it's easily a disappointment compared to 1992. That's all I have to say. What makes the new Immortal release so disappointing in my opinion does not have to do with Mabath's absence of vocals. I think the issue lands with the whole album as itself, with the ideas and the riffs on this one being really forgettable and boring, and it was one of those albums that just flew by as completely uninteresting. Yeah, that was one of the most mediocre black metal albums I've heard all year, and it's sad that it's coming in one of the most legendary bands in the genre. When it comes to Oneohtrix Point Never's discography, it's a hit or miss for me. There are albums that I absolutely love, like Replica and Garden of Delete, and then there are others like Returnal and R+7 that are just okay. And unfortunately, Age of falls to the latter. I thought, considering how great of a release Garden of Delete was, that we will take some of the same. However, I think it just took every weak part of Garden on Delete and it just put it in one album. And also the heavily affected vocals on this one most of the time just come as really underwhelming and as the worst part of the album. It's an okay experimental ambient release, but it's not even close to some of his best stuff he has done in the past. I knew that I was not going to love this collab. Short after the Body released one of their best works to date. I don't know why, but I just thought that the new collab with Uniform was coming way too soon. I was worried this was going to be rushed, and this is exactly the result. If they would just wait, record more material and use some better ideas and release this album like this year, I think we would have an extremely good collab project with two of the biggest bands of underground noise rock and sludge metal of this decade. But yeah, this album feels rushed and it's kind of disappointing. I had huge hopes for this album, considering that their previous work was one of my favorite albums of the year. But what I can give to this one is that this is by far their best produced album. No other Necronomidol album has that clear and such pristine and detailed sound as this. I just think the issue is that the ideas presented in this one are not that memorable, and their direction to a more metal sound and less electronic and idolish and pop has as a result an album that it's not that varied or that intriguing and leaves a lot to be desired. It's an okay album, but it's not close to Deathless. It's been a while since I've heard from anything new from Hypnoskull, but I decided to give this one a shot, and it was nothing that special. Some of his old works are some of the finest examples of industrial and power noise music. This one, on the other hand, sounds like a completely uninspiring, boring, predictable and generic, sort of industrial techno album with some elements of power noise to it, but it's nothing that intense. Most of the time it's just bland, and the album is way too long, and I think it drags it for a long time. So, not one of my favorite industrial and underground releases of this year, that's for sure. I liked End Position. I wasn't that crazy about it compared to lots of people who've heard of this album, but I think it was a nice blend of different sounds and genres, and it was a really heavy and aggressive album. Now, this one was going to a bit of a different sound, which was teased with some of the previous tracks they made. I think I gave a very positive position to one of the EPs they made, but this new album just flew out of everyone's radar. This album was forgettable, it was disappointing, and it's not because of a new sound, but I don't think they made that much of a justice to this one. And it's sad because I really saw high potential for this one, but who knows? Maybe the next Street Sects project will be something really different and will be probably even something better. I like so many works from Xibalba, which is a Greek ritual ambient project by Aherodas, and he makes some really great blends of dark ambient with ritual ambient and some really spooky and haunting sounds. So I was hyped for the new album and I listened to it and I felt that something was missing. Most of the elements that made the previous albums special and unique and interesting, I cannot find them here. It's more of like the background sounds and the whole melody and tribal feel to it is sort of missing. I mean, sure, there are elements that remind you that this has like a tribal, a ritual aesthetic to it, but most of the time it's just bland background, sort of noisy sounds. But still it's decent, but yeah, I think Xibalba has so many better works than this. Drew McDonald is back with his third solo full-length album, mostly known for his contribution on the legendary Time Machines and some other drone projects of Coil on this period, and I loved A Natural Channel, his second album. It was such a great mix of drone and dark ambient music. So what happened here? I was expecting this thing, but I was underwhelmed by it. It's a nice album, but it could have been way better. This was one of my most hyped albums of the year, mostly because I love the three singles out of this thing. AS Too Wrong, AS AWOL and AS Chaos are some of the hardest and most intense bangers I've heard all year, and I was so anticipating for this album, but it's sad that the rest of it is mostly like filler or uninteresting. The only songs I ended up loving on this thing are actually the teaser tracks and the first song as well. The rest of the thing kind of just passed by, some sort of ambient or chill tracks that don't really have a direction to anywhere and just end without offering that much to an album other than just be there. Though I highly recommend you to go and listen to this album. It's one of the most unique and one of the most boundary pushing albums that were released this year. Intense industrial and deconstructed club album that shifts the entire genre and goes to a new level. So I really hope this album takes the attention it deserves, and hopefully you might like this album more than I do. I wanted to like this album so much. I pretty much love every single thing Nicole Dolaganger has ever done. And I loved Lemonade. I really love this song. But the mixing on this thing and some of the instrumentals kind of having this weird electronic direction to them, especially on the second half of this album, really left me underwhelmed. And I think this is one of the weakest releases from Nicole Dolaganger, if not the weakest one. I highly recommend you though to go and listen to Nicole Dolaganger. She has done some great folk albums over the decades. Poppy was probably the one female artist in pop music I was anticipating a new album the most, because I really loved Poppy.Computer. Such a short, straight to the point album with a great touch on technology and how we approach and appreciate music these days. So I was really looking forward to what she will do next. Now, in terms of production and ideas, this is way better, it's way more varied. There are even some metal songs at the end of this thing, but there's nothing else here. Everything else is just gone. Poppy, who at first sounded like one of the most boundary-pushing pop artists, now in this one, she sounds like any other generic female pop artist currently. And what hurts is the music as well, because it's mostly generic pop music. And if you count out X, I couldn't find anything special out of this album. It was another mediocre pop album. But I'm still going to look forward to whatever she and Titanic Sinclair are going to do in the future at a musical standpoint. So after all of this, number one pick of my biggest disappointment of 2018 is... This is the worst album from Venetian Snares, and by far the most disappointing one. As much as it's creative with the album and song titles, when it comes to music, is the most unimaginative thing he has ever done. This album is a mix of speedcore and flashcore. We still get some of the extremely fast and unorthodox drum sounds from Venetian Snares with some eerie ambient music in the background, but it's by far the most one-dimensional thing he has ever done. If you've heard the first song, you've pretty much heard of the rest of the album. Nothing really changes, from the ambience to the beats themselves. Most of the beats, the drum sounds are identical, and it's shocking coming from an artist who used to do some extremely versatile albums in the past. And also, I thought he would redeem himself with his collab with Daniel Lanois, and at first listen I liked what I heard, but the more I listened to it, the more I got bored out of it. It's another one-dimensional album, and there's not that much of a connection to the sounds they fuse together, and so this actually makes it for two disappointing releases from Venetian Snares the same year. So it's like a double number one, and so that's it. My top 25 most disappointing releases of 2018. What were the albums you were disappointed with? Let me know down in the comments. Leave a like if you enjoyed the video, subscribe for more content like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.